Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Fundamentals of Land Protection course.
Why don't we go ahead and hand it over to Rob and Jassy to introduce themselves and get started.
Well, great, thank you. Rob Warren here with Jassy, Bratko, and I am going to launch our PowerPoint and start working our way through our discussion today.
And I hope you'll give you a little bit of a self-introduction, Rob and Jassy, so people know your backgrounds in land conservation.
We will indeed. In fact, Jassy, you want to start?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jassy Bratko. I'm currently happily retired, but I was the former Director of Land Protection for North County Land Trust and was on the Hubbardston Open Space Committee for over 20 years and chaired it for most of that time.
And I'm Rob Warren. I am failing at trying to retire. I was with the Mass Department of Fish and Game for many years, then a long spell with the Nature Conservancy's Massachusetts chapter, and then most recently working with the trustees and now doing some work as an independent consultant. So between us, we've got a lot of years doing this. Doesn't mean we know everything, but we've bumped into a lot of issues and challenges along the way, and looking forward to sharing some of that information today. I do want to note that this session is in the context of an ongoing course. This is the first of 5 courses that will be presented over the month of June, as Barbara mentioned. And today we are starting with the basics of land protection, understanding real estate and protection tools. Our general agenda for the day is, as it shows here, we'll be talking some about how we think and talk about land rights and do deals with them. Talking a bit about how a generic land conservation deal may sequence out, which is a model only and not how most things actually go. We'll talk a bit about who the most active players and partners are in the Massachusetts landscape. We will talk through a range of land protection tools, and we'll end with some discussion of the Registry of Deeds, what you might find there, how to understand it, and how to dig that information out. I will note this is an introduction level course. We're going to be moving fairly quickly, and as Barbara said, we will certainly have questions at the end, and as time allows, we may take a question or two, excuse me, along the way. So I'm going to jump in and talk a little bit about land rights, how we think about them, talk about them, how the law treats them, and again, at a fairly high level, but I think it's helpful to dissect this a little bit and talk about some of the language that gets used in land transactions and conveyancing. So it is useful to think about land ownership in a classic metaphor of being a bundle of sticks, where each stick in that bundle represents a different way to use the land or an activity on the land. Traditional or more common ones include separation of timber rights from fundamental land ownership. We hear a lot from our Western state colleagues about issues of water rights being separated from land ownership. Mineral extraction, that actually is, I've encountered that here in Massachusetts, where the land was owned by one party and a mineral mining company owned mineral rights. No risk of them using them, but they were separate. It was a separate stick that had been owned separately. And then there's a whole range of easements. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but rights to cross land and kind of a lighter touch on a shared ownership. It's important to understand that these are not predefined sticks in the bundle. So as two parties, a landowner and a other party, are working on parsing these sticks, they can create the one that they feel they need. And it's not something, as I say, that is a preset, predetermined list that you could work with. So in that bundle of sticks, there's often a big stick that we call a fee ownership. So somebody at some level is the landowner, or some group of somebody's is the landowner. And so that is, you may have heard the phrase, the fee owner of the land is so-and-so. And that is what that refers to, is kind of a fundamental, probably the largest clump of sticks is in that fee owner. Fee simple simply is a phrase that means somebody owns all the sticks. If you own all the rights, you don't have easements across your land, someone else doesn't control an element of it other than through law and regulation, then you probably own that land in fee simple manner. You'll also hear folks talk about undivided interests. That is a situation where multiple parties truly co-own the land. So if, for example, 3 siblings inherit property from a parent, they each have a 1/3 undivided interest. They each own basically 1/3 of each stick in that bundle. So it's not that one of them owns a piece geographically or one of them owns a subset of the rights. They all own all of it together in an undivided manner. And then another phrase you're going to hear today and beyond is the idea of an encumbrance on ownership. And that basically means that somebody else owns a stick out of the bundle other than the fee owner. And that other right is considered an encumbrance on the ownership of the primary fee owner. And the last phrase I want to mention here is this idea, and this is very much kind of a vernacular, not a legal phrase, but people say, oh yeah, that water rights run with the land. And what that means is that, that the right transfers from one owner to another separate from the main bundle of sticks. So for example, if I own the land and you own the water rights on my land, your water rights can be transacted separately from me transacting fundamental ownership of the land. So that water right runs with the land. And that's in contrast to, say, a contract between 2 parties. A contract does not run with the land. When ownership changes, that contract kind of becomes irrelevant. A conservation restriction, Jassy will be talking about this more in a little bit. But one way to think about a conservation restriction is that the CR is a carefully selected, carefully defined set of the sticks out of that bundle that are being transferred to the land trust. The model doesn't work entirely there, but again, it's just another way to use this metaphor to understand how a conservation restriction plays out with the ownership. It's also important to understand that our legal system across the country has a preference embedded in the law for land being used. And for those of us who sometimes want to see land not be used, this can be a challenge. But if you do this work for a while, you will run into a reference to the rule against perpetuities. And that is simply the idea in the law that restrictions should not remain forever. Even after their utility or purpose or advantage may long have faded. And there's actually a section in the law that says conditions or restrictions on the land shall be limited to the term of 30 years. And there are, of course, exceptions to that. But if you and your neighbor put covenants on the land saying nobody can put cars up on cinder blocks in the front yard, that simply expires 30 years after you record that covenant at the Registry of Deeds. There are exceptions, conservation restrictions being an important one, but it's to write something that does not fall under the conservation restriction statute and goes longer than 30 years is a tricky legal maneuver, and the law is kind of designed to undermine those efforts. So good thing to be aware of. I also simply want to note that when you are recording a conveyance, we all have heard about getting it down to the Registry of Deeds and getting that document on record. There are, in fact, a couple of different ways that can happen when you get there. Most land transactions are simply recorded at the Registry of Deeds. That's the vast majority of conveyancing that happens. There is, however, another track called land registration. And That refers to specific properties that have been litigated through the Massachusetts Land Court. And when you come out of a land court case, there is a survey plan that is very specific and has very specific requirements to be approved through the land court. And the title is just perfect. The judge bangs the gavel, and whatever they say the ownership is, that is what it is. There's no kind of digging in the past behind that. And it's also good to know it's a different desk at the registry and a different search on the online registry, which we'll talk about late in the session. Jassy, up to you.
Thanks, Rob. So your organization has found a piece of land that you would like to protect. It checks all the right boxes that meet your mission. There's great wildlife habitat, water protection, contiguous with other protected land. It meets your mission. So how do you go about starting on this journey? And what is the journey you're going to go on to protect land? And I always picture it in my head as a trip down a river in a kayak. You start out and everything's smooth and you've got to deal with the landowner, you think you do, and you start down this journey to buy the land and you go around a bend and all of a sudden you hit some obstacles, some white water, if you will, and you have to do a little bit of negotiation, you have to do a little bit of sidestepping and have to think things out. And then you work your way through that and you can carry on and see to the end of the journey. And Rob alluded to this earlier, that the deal sequence is general, but there's sometimes hitches along the way, but you don't want to give up. Sometimes they can take a long time. I've been involved in a project that was 10 years from beginning to end. So don't quit on it. But generally, a land protection project will follow the same sort of similar patterns. So you'll start off by discussing with the landowner what it is that the landowner wants out of this deal and whether or not you can match what that landowner wants, whether or not you can come to a mutual agreement. Does the landowner want to sell the land? Do they want to retain ownership but sell a conservation restriction? Do they want to donate it and get a big tax break, or are they looking for the maximum amount of money possible? So you want to find out if what they want is something that you can give them. And when you feel that you can come to an agreement, then you're going to put in an offer. If you're working with a realtor, you may have to put in a small monetary amount along with that offer, and you hope that your offer will be accepted. But if it's not, you've hit that first little obstacle in the journey, and you might have to negotiate a little bit. But finally, hopefully you'll come to an agreement and you'll move on to a purchase and sale agreement. Now, this is a legally binding document, and you want to think about it very carefully. It's generally written by the buyer's realtor or attorney, and there will generally be substantial deposit that you will have to pay to secure that purchase and sale agreement that you can lose if you renege on your part of the deal. So in a purchase and sale agreement, it will list who the parties involved are, the purchase price, when you hope to close, among other things, and importantly, it will list the contingencies for that purchase and sale. So the contingencies are a way that if things don't work out to your expectations, you're not held to that agreement. You can get out of it and not lose that deposit. So contingencies can be certain things like, contingent on the grant funding that you've applied for, contingent on a necessary town vote, contingent on a clean 21E hazardous waste inspection, a title search or a survey. So once both parties have signed this purchase and sale agreement, then you'll move on to due diligence, which I'm not going to talk about a lot because you're going to be covering it later. But due diligence is where you're going to do the research to make sure that your contingencies can be met. You're going to you're going to get that grant funding, you're going to get that town meeting vote. You've got a clean 21E inspection. So your contingencies are met. If there are some outstanding issues, if you need to find more funding, or if you discovered a whole bunch of 50-gallon barrels on the property that might contain hazardous waste, you're going to ask the owner to remove them. You're going to resolve the outstanding issues in your purchase and sale agreement. And when everything is resolved, you're going to move towards closing. The closing used to be done, everybody sitting around a table, all the parties involved, and signing a bunch of papers, including the deed. Typically now, most of it is done online. The deed will be drawn up by the seller's attorney. It will always be written up by an attorney. And the lender, if there is a lender involved, or an attorney, will draw up a HUD agreement, which will outline all of the different financial responsibilities of each party, what the purchase price is, and deposits that have been paid, any outstanding real estate taxes, any commission that is owed. All of this will be listed on a form so that each party knows how much money they have to bring to the closing. And then the closing will happen. The deed will be recorded at the Registry of Deeds. There is a fee. Last time I looked, it was $155 to record a deed. And also conservation restrictions, if you're working with a conservation restriction, will also be recorded. And it's important to remember all during this process that once you've successfully gotten to closing and now you own that land or that conservation restriction, your organization is responsible for stewarding that in perpetuity. So you want to make sure that you have the ability and the wherewithal to do that. And that's it. If there's any questions?
There are a couple questions, but they might be from last time. Are you open for them now?
Sure.
Okay, so there's a question about perpetuity. Does it apply to utility right-of-ways and leases with a term longer than 30 years?
I'll give a quick answer, but there's a lot of detail in all of this. That bit of language that I had on the screen talked about how restrictions on use of land expire after 30 years. So an affirmative right, like a utility easement, is actually a stick out of the bundle that the utility company owns. So that is perpetual and does not expire. Leases are not a conveyancing thing. They are essentially a contract between two parties. Depending on how they're written and their length, they can be considered an interest in land, but they're generally not recorded at the Registry of Deeds. And a lease running longer than 30 years, I would ask a lawyer to review it. I think that's an unusually long term, but I would recommend getting legal input on a specific case because it will depend in large part on the language there. But a lease is largely a contract, which is, I would argue, probably not directly susceptible to the rule against perpetuities.
Two more quick questions. Who pays the recording fee?
The recording fee is generally paid by the buyer.
Okay. And can the 30-year restriction be renewed?
If it is set up properly and fits under a different nearby statute in the Mass General laws, you can in theory create a restriction for that says on its face 100 years, and under the law that will expire after 30 unless it is renewed before that last day of the 30 years. And then under the statute, every 20 years thereafter, it has to be renewed until you get up to the maximum stated term on the face of of the document.
There is another question, but I'm not really sure how you'd answer.
Bob, I think
Yeah, I think we'll stop now, yeah?
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think the question relates to how might one go from a easement to a CR, meaning perhaps how might one go from a term easement to a perpetual CR?
We'll be talking about various protection tools a little bit further along. So I'm going to ask whoever that question is from to raise it again if you don't glean an answer from what we talk about here.
That's all for now.
Okay, thank you.
So in Massachusetts, there are 4 entities that can hold conservation land. The state, the municipalities, land trusts, or the federal government. And some of these entities will also have funding available for protecting land, and others may just give funding but not hold any interest. So in the state, for example, the agencies such as the Department of Conservation and Recreation, both the Division of Parks and the Water Division, will both hold land and fee or conservation restrictions, and they will also have funding available for purchasing land. Department of Fish and Wildlife, Department of Fish and Game is another agency that will do both of those things. Department of Conservation Services has money available in the form of grants that they will give out for different land protection projects, but they don't actually hold land. So the state is one major player. Municipalities, really there are 3 different boards or commissions that can hold property within a municipality. The Parks Commission, that is typically more for active recreation, like ballparks, playgrounds, and so on. The Conservation Commission, which will hold land for more passive type recreation, or the DPW or the Water Department for that municipality where they want to protect either a reservoir or watershed land for their drinking water supply. Land trusts can also hold land in fee or CRs, and there are many, many, many land trusts in Massachusetts. I believe Massachusetts has more land trusts than any other state, but correct me if I'm wrong on that. They will also have some of the large ones may have funding available, and but this typically is a smaller amount and will generally be in some form of a revolving account that they have to recoup once the project is done. They will help to pay for things like due diligence or advancing funds if a property has to be taken off the market very quickly. So, and the federal government, the national parks or the US Forest Service also holds land, and the Forest Service, for example, will give grants in the form of the Forest Legacy is one example, the Forest Legacy Program. There are many, many different foundations out there who will provide funding for land protection projects, but they don't have the ability to own any land. They're just helped by providing the funding. And then, of course, private donors. No private person can hold conservation land. The conservation rights would have to be held by another party, but they will offer funding. And it's not unusual, especially in larger projects, for more than 2 of these players to be involved at any given time. I was working on one project where we had the Department of Conservation and Recreation, Fish and Game, a municipality, 2 different land trusts, and multiple foundations. So the larger projects, you will get many different players all cooperating together. But the important thing is when you're looking at a project and where you might find funding or who you might partner with to hold this interest in the land, would be that their mission matches what your mission is. So for example, it's no good approaching Fish and Game to ask them if they will hold a conservation restriction on a piece of property where the owner will not allow hunting. They won't do it. You don't want to approach a water department for funding if you want to develop that water resource into a town beach. It's highly likely that they won't do that. So you want to be sure that the any entity that you're approaching, their mission matches your mission. Are there any questions on that?
I don't see any questions currently. If anybody has one, type quickly. I don't see any, so I think we can proceed.
Okay. You want to advance it, Rob? Okay, so there are two major ways that land can be conserved. The first is through a fee transfer. If you remember from the previous section, we're talking about that bundle of sticks, and the entire bundle is transferred from one owner to another. The original owner of that land no longer has any rights in the property whatsoever. And this is recorded by the with a deed at the Registry of Deeds, in which that serves that particular town. The second way is with a conservation restriction, and in any other state but Massachusetts, this is going to be called a conservation easement. But in Massachusetts, we call them conservation restrictions. They're one and the same thing. And it's a general sort of a term where the owner of the land will retain ownership, but will give up certain rights. They'll give up certain sticks within that bundle. And to a great degree, or to some degree, I should say, this conservation restriction can be negotiated with the landowner and tailored to their needs. So for example, if a landowner wishes to retain the right to do a timber harvest, that can be written into the conservation restriction. If the landowner wants to retain the right to do agriculture, or maybe to even build a barn, if they want to allow hunting, or if they want to prohibit hunting, those sorts of things can be written into a conservation restriction as reserved rights. Basically, what a conservation restriction is doing is taking away the right to develop that land, to mine that land, and to destroy it in any way. Conservation restrictions are long documents. They're probably 20 to 30 pages long. They'll list both the buyer and the grantor, and who's giving that restriction and who is holding that restriction. And it can be held by one of the four entities that I mentioned in the previous section. The state, a town, or federal government, or a land trust. And again, this is recorded at the Registry of Deeds. So it is a legal document that is recorded at the Registry of Deeds where the owner is giving up certain rights on the land. There are, conservation restriction is a general term. There are more specific types of restriction. For example, an agricultural preservation restriction is held by the Department of Agriculture on land, farmland, or property that has more than 50% of prime agricultural soils, and the land must be kept in a state suitable for farming, and they like it to be kept in active agriculture. It's frowned on if it's not kept up in active agriculture, but it must at the very least be kept so active agriculture can be pursued in the future. There is a water preservation restriction. These will be held by a state agency such as Department of Conservation and Recreation, the Water Division. or by a municipality, their water department, to protect their drinking water supplies. So water preservation restriction is specifically to protect a drinking water supply. And then we have a historical preservation restriction, which we debated about including, because this actually refers to buildings, not land. It's to maintain the historical integrity of a building, but in certain cases, you may be trying to preserve a piece of land that has a historic building, and you want to do both at the same time. So yeah, I think that about covers everything there. The one thing I wanted to mention too, actually, is that the state will have a, there is a model CR that gives the basic language that will be in a conservation restriction, but it can be adapted. There are certain places where it shows it can be adapted to suit that landowner's need. Rod?
So I'm going to talk a little bit about some other types of conveyancing. This first group, it really is an extension of what Jassy was talking about, but these are really, well, let me not characterize them. Let me work through them and let them speak for themselves. So, but these are other tools that land conservation organizations may find a use for as you work towards either a specific objective that you achieve through one of these tools, or using one of these as an interim step towards eventual more complete protection of a property. Easements really are affirmative rights to do something on someone else's land. Classic ones are, as came up in the questions, utility easements, where the power company has, or telephone company or gas pipeline company has a right to engage in very specific activities, usually on a narrow corridor of land that crosses many other ownerships. And those are not subject to the rule against perpetuity. Those are actual sticks out of the bundle that transfer to the power company or the utility company. Rights of way are something that if you do much conveyancing, especially in rural areas, as many of us do, you're going to come across, which is simply a right of one person to cross the land of another. Classic example is, if I own 50 acres and the farmer who lives next to me has a field on the other side of me, somewhere along the way in the transaction history, that farmer may have acquired the right to use a certain cart path across my land to reach their other field. So those sorts of right-of-way easements are quite common. They're also used for residential properties. Generally Massachusetts, you need to have road frontage to have a buildable house lot, but not everyone accesses their house through their road frontage. So some people come in on a driveway that crosses the back piece of someone else's land, and they have a deeded right-of-way to do that. Rights of way can vary a lot. Some are very specific. Some have a surveyed route that they follow. Many of them are older and vaguer. But generally, there is nothing, a right-of-way does not put any obligation on the landowner to maintain the quality of a road or a way. They can't obstruct it. But if, in the example, my farmer neighbor wants to continue to use that cart path, they're going to have to clear the tree that falls down in it. They're going to have to, mow as needed, et cetera, address washouts and things like that. So the landowner doesn't have a burden of providing a way. It's simply that someone else has a right to use that way across the land. Another handy tool is acquiring a life estate or acquiring land from someone in a manner that it does not actually transfer use right away. So the life estate and remainder interests are sort of two sides of the same coin. There are many projects where land trust has basically acquired land and leaves with the landowner a lifelong right to continue to use the land as a woodland camping site, as timberland, as a farm, as a residence. Ownership transfers at the front end of that arrangement, but the use doesn't change until either the individual with the life estate dies or surrenders their remaining rights. Interestingly, that surrender of remaining life estate before death can be considered a charitable contribution. So, this is an interesting tool. Sometimes it's what you can get. Someone's not, they want to make sure it's going to get protected, but they're not ready to leave the land. But then maybe 5-10 years later, they are ready to leave. They get another charitable gift when they surrender more of the remaining use of that property. And then there are kind of almost side deal kinds of things where a specific minor use is retained. Occasionally that's in the deed, occasionally that's done as a side letter. There was a project I was involved in a long time ago, and what got the deal done was telling the 3 siblings that they could continue to cut Christmas trees there, one each every year for as long as they chose to. And that let the protection, the perpetual protection, go into place on that property. So those are a little tricky, and a little tricky if there is a charitable deduction being taken, because in a sense, someone is getting something back of value. So you need to think that through. But it's an interesting way to just be thinking openly about what may get the landowner kind of across the finish line in a way that is comfortable to them. Then there are a number of things that you can do that are essentially buying time. They're not really getting the protection done, but they're moving you in that general direction. So unreasonable value expectations on the part of the landowner. If they think their $300,000 property is worth $1 million, that you aren't going to be able to protect it and acquire it, but they're not going to find a buyer for it anywhere else either. So it's not something you want to rely on in any deep way, but you can take a little bit of comfort as you work towards a reasonable arrangement. Flawed title is another. If there are real issues with the ownership history of the land, it can be very difficult for the landowner to find a buyer. You may work with a landowner on resolving those issues over time so that you could, as the land trust, acquire that. But that also is relationship building. And so by the time, you would probably do that under a purchase and sale agreement with a contingency that if we can resolve those title issues, then the land trust will perform and acquire the property. An option is another tool that's used. This is really a right. So the land trust acquires an option on the property, which is a one-way obligation. So the landowner can't sell it to anyone else. They can only sell it to the land trust, but the land trust is not obligated to buy as it is in a purchase and sale agreement. So this is kind of a one-way deal. And again, it generally will cost some money, but it gives you time to investigate fundraising potential, or any other, as I say, it's buying time. There are many reasons you may find that you want to buy time on a project. A right of first refusal is something that gets talked about a lot more than it gets used in my experience, but they are definitely out there. And it is a good way if you have a conservation motivated landowner who really is not ready to do a transaction. A right of first refusal is again, a conveyancing document. It goes on record at the Registry of Deeds. It does not transfer ownership of the land. It simply says that presumably the land trust has the right to step in and take over any deal if the landowner is getting ready to sell or transact the property. So for example, what it really means is landowner gives a right of first refusal to the land trust, and years go by and the landowner says, all right, it's time to go. So they may market the property, find a buyer, and then the right of first refusal kicks in, and they have to take that deal to the land trust and say, hey, do you want to buy it at the same cost and timeline that Joe Schmo is saying they'll buy it? And the land trust then has an opportunity to try and scramble and perform. A better version of this includes a right of first offer in it, which basically says to the landowner, before you market it, come talk to us and we'll see if we can work out a deal. It's no fun being in the position of kind of spoiling a deal by, where the landowner has marketed it, has a broker perhaps, has found a buyer, and then we step in to kind of explode the deal. Better to have that conversation at the front end if possible. So there's a so-called right of first offer and refusal. Again, these are not, off the shelf. You kind of get to customize it as you negotiate with a particular landowner. Talked about that. And then having the land in so-called as chapter land enrolled in the property tax abatement programs or reduction programs under Chapter 61, Chapter 61A, and Chapter 61B. We're not going to go into those in depth. There's a lot of information on those. Mass Woods website, which will flash on the screen at the end, has some great information on how that really works. They're complicated, but they create a right of first refusal. It's basically a program where a landowner can enroll, reduce their property taxes, and if and when they later are coming out of the program due to intended sale of the property or a number of situations, the town basically gets a right to step in and acquire the property or assign that right to a land trust. So again, a great opportunity and a great reason to be building relationships with landowners and with your town officials. Let's see, term restrictions. This came up in the questions, I think. You certainly can acquire a term restriction, meaning not perpetual, but for a stated period of time. They are going to be subject to the rule against perpetuities, but that's often okay. You're buying time, so it gives you 30 years in the first instance, and if it's set up for renewals, it could go longer. So again, it can be written very much like a conservation restriction. It can look like a full-blown conservation restriction, or it can be a simpler document. But as I say, they're limited in time. They do not constitute a charitable contribution, and again, it's a way to delay something bad happening on the land while you work towards more complete preservation. Undivided interest I spoke about earlier. There are situations where land trusts have deliberately acquired a partial interest in land, maybe from one sibling who was more willing than the others, and the land trust is basically either hoping that the others will come around or simply acquiring enough of a land interest to be a spoiler. The other 2/3 owners, for example, cannot build carve it up into house lots, sell pieces of it, build houses on it, as long as someone who is a partial owner holds an undivided interest is saying no. Basically, no one can do anything. It's not exactly a great situation, but again, it can stall bad things happening. And then there's the possibility of rights conveyances, buying a stick out of the bundle. If there's something very specific you're caring about on a property, there may be a deal like that where you can buy the water rights, buy the timber rights, if that's really the threat that you are most concerned about. And I'm realizing that back when I was talking about rights easements, I had trail easement on the screen, but did not talk about that. So let me just flip back in our brains to that moment. So an easement, a trail easement, is a tool that is used by land trusts for doing just that, acquiring a permanent or perhaps a term right to allow the public to hike a trail across someone's private property. That may be the ultimate goal for that relationship, or that may be a step towards demonstrating that the world is not going to come to an end with a little public recreation, and maybe permanent protection of more of the land is a good idea for everyone. I think we can pause there for questions. Anything? I see some things in the chat, but I don't know what's in there.
Yeah, no, there was one, I think you answered it but not sure. Say more about trail easements. You just did. Scenarios under which that occurs, I think you did. Are they termed or permanent or both?
Either. Yeah.
Okay.
It's again, all of these, none of these are a rigid box of a tool. They are all a concept that you can negotiate, manipulate up to a certain point with legal advice, and make fit your circumstance. But they're part of the fun and part of the challenge of doing this work is kind of figuring out, okay, what tool can I bring to the table here, and how can I morph it a little bit to fit the situation that we have.
There's a question, and I don't know if it's a typo, but if you could clarify, I think they meant, what's the difference between an option or the right of first refusal? Is there a very small, yeah.
Yep, definitely. A few things. So an option is usually for, months to a year or so. It's kind of a shorter stopgap. And it is essentially a contract, a one-way contract by and large, though everyone signs it. But it basically is an option saying, okay, we the land trust have the right to buy your land for $120,000 as long as we trigger our right before 6 months expires and close before 8 months expires. And then we run around and raise money, and but if so, you might use that in a situation where you are a little concerned about your ability to perform ultimately, and you don't want to commit to buying it, but you want to lock it up so that it requires a fairly collaborative approach from the landowner, because they are essentially agreeing to keep their property off the market for a period of time, and there is often a payment, non-refundable payment for doing that. So that's pluses and minuses on the option. The right of first refusal is more open-ended, and it's less a contract. It is actually considered a real estate right. That if the land trust acquires a right of first refusal from a landowner, that landowner cannot sell to anyone else ever, unless there's a term limit in the right of first refusal, without bringing that land back to the land trust and saying, hey, I've got a deal, do you want to take over the deal? Step into the shoes of the buyer, as the jargon is often phrased. And so that's a longer term thing. Frankly, I've had the experience of more than once of those kind of popping up where it was years old. It was not being tracked by the organization that held the right of first refusal, and suddenly we're like thinking about a property that we hadn't been thinking about, and we have 30 days to decide what we're going to do with it or not. So that's a few differences between those two tools, and a few different sort of situations where you might pick one over the other.
Okay, two more. One was the question from before about going from going from an easement to a CR. I'm not quite sure what the question is, but is there a time, and when or how would you do that?
From a term easement to a perpetual CR.
Jassy, do you want to jump in, or I can blather on?
No, go ahead.
Okay. You can do that. So I certainly had situations where my organization had acquired what looked for all the world like a conservation restriction, but did not have the municipal and state approvals in it. If you're lucky, there's a paragraph that says, if municipal and state approvals are secured, this can be converted to a permanent conservation restriction under the Massachusetts statute. Looking at a messier situation, let's say a land trust negotiated a term easement 17 years ago, and the ownership has changed, and now we've got an owner who's willing to put a permanent conservation restriction in place. There's nothing that says you can't do that. You could ignore the term easement and simply put the new CR in place. They're kind of layered up on the land, which is awkward for interpreting as a given activity on the property, but not legally problematic or legally objectionable. It might be problematic. And if they differ in terms, in any instance, they both apply. So whichever of those two things is more restrictive on use of the land, that controls in a given situation. Now, one of the complicating elements there is the term easement that's been sitting on the land for a while did not generate a charitable deduction, whereas the conservation restriction, if it's being donated or bargain sale, could generate a tax deduction. However, if the new permanent CR is simply making permanent something that is already restricted for 30 years, your appraiser has a challenge, because you're not actually, at the moment of the gift of the CR, that is not the time where you are extinguishing housing development on the property, right? You're not actually extinguishing that until the term easement expires X years hence. So it gets a little messy, but so there's a lot to think about in it. But the fact that there is a term easement on the land, or term restriction on the land, does not mean you should not be trying to puzzle your way through a permanent conservation outcome.
There's one very quick question. I think that's a yes or no. Another one more complex. So maybe the more complex one you can answer independently afterwards. The quick one is, if a land trust has an easement, do they have the right to steward the land, meaning manage invasives, move the trail within the boundaries, or do other maintenance?
So if the land trust has an easement, let's say if land trust has an easement or a term restriction or any number of these other things, the land trust only has the rights that are stated in that document. So if the land trust holds a trail easement, you need to look at that trail easement. Does it say you can do anything more than maintain a 4-foot wide walkable path? Does it allow for vegetation management? My guess, well, maybe, maybe not. Whereas in a full-blown conservation restriction, it is not uncommon to restrict all damage to vegetation, but then allow habitat restoration, which might let you go in with the permission of the landowner and treat invasives. So it really depends on the very specific rights that have been transacted on that project. That was the quick one, right?
That was a quick one. So if you need to move on, we'll move on. Else I could read you the not so quick one.
Why don't we move forward and
Okay.
we can hold that one. Our next section is talking about the registry of deeds and understanding a deed when you have it in hand. And then I do think we'll have some time at the end for more questions. Great, thank you.
So the registry of deeds is where every transaction, every land transaction or property transaction in Massachusetts is recorded. And there's actually 21 different registries of deeds, each registry serving a particular geographic area. And this isn't true in every state. For example, Vermont and Connecticut, their deeds are recorded by the town clerk. So it's really from state to state. But in Massachusetts, land transactions are always recorded at the registry. Many, many years ago, my husband and I bought a house that was built in 1820. And we were really interested to find out more about the history of the house and the ownership and whatever we could learn about it. So we spent an afternoon in the Worcester Registry and disappeared down to the basement and was going through books and came out 4 hours later, fascinated by what we learned. Because who knew that we had the right to cross our owner's property to get to the back pasture for purposes of grazing? And who knew they had the right to do that on our property? But that's what you can find at the Registry of Deeds. You you can find all sorts of interesting facts about that property. And whenever you're looking to purchase a piece of land, you want to check the deed to see what's written in there. And we'll go into that a little more later, but nowadays, for most of you, the registry of deeds, even though they're still buildings, the actual physical registry, for most of you, the registry will be a portal, Mass Land Records. That's where you'll go to research deeds. And most deeds, as I alluded to before, are not now recorded on paper, in person, but with electronic signatures and then filed electronically at the registry. Next one. So by law, a deed in Massachusetts has to contain certain information, the elements of that deed. So there is always the grantor, the person who is selling, the persons or entity that is selling that property, the grantee, the persons or entity that is purchasing that property, and the address of the owner, because the town needs to know where to send the tax bill, right? So they need the address of the owners. The consideration, how much is being paid for that property, how much is being paid for the transfer. And in a case where a piece of property is being donated, it will typically say for consideration of less than $100. You'll never see this as being donated. It will be a consideration of less than $100, or some instances you may see $1. The words of grant, where it clearly shows that the current owner is transferring ownership to the new owner. The grantor is transferring ownership to the grantee. And the covenants, what sort of a deed it's going to be. In Massachusetts, most deeds are quitclaim deeds, which that really, it's a certain guarantee of the title of that property. The landowner is saying that he had clear title to the property during his ownership, but not before, which makes it really important every time you're purchasing property, you do a title search to make sure that that grantor actually is legally entitled to sell the land. A property description, it's not sufficient just to have a location or an address of the property. It has to be described in detail, either in writing with every line of the perimeter of the property outlined, the direction, the length to a drill hole or an iron pin. Typically in older deeds you hear there may be an oak tree, but you don't see that now really, or ever. Or it could be a recorded plan, and I'll talk about that a little more in a minute. There would be a title reference. So how did the current owner come by that property? What was the book and page? Deeds are always recorded in book and page. What was the book and page of that deed? And who did he received that property from, and when did he receive it? A property address, which will always be shown on the left-hand side of the deed, so that the municipality knows where it's actually located. A date of execution, when the deed was signed. The grantor's signature, doesn't necessarily need the grantee's signature, but it definitely needs the grantor's signature, which must be acknowledged by a notary. So it will be notarized. And then it will be actually recorded at the correct registry for that municipality's geographic location. And as I mentioned before, there is a recording fee for doing that. So it's really, really important that you always look through deeds, especially to check if there's any encumbrances. Rob mentioned things like right-of-ways. that there may be a right of way from a utility company or a trail, or the right of way to pass over the property to build a house in the back, put a driveway in. There may be liens on the property, there may be a mortgage, or that owner may owe money to creditors who's put a lien on the property. You need to check and see if there's any encumbrances, and also if there's anything particularly unique. It will help you to discover if a parcel is being sold. If, for example, a parcel of that land is being sold. So next one. So I talked about the property description. One property description is in the form of meets and bounds. And these descriptions are typically transferred from one deed to the next. So the meets and bounds description will be transferred from the previous deed, unless any land has been sold, in which case it will change. And it will say in detail the perimeter, what the perimeter of that line is. So beginning at the southeasterly corner, at a drill hole in a stone wall on a particular road, and it will show you how far you're going in that direction and to what marker, an iron pin or a drill hole. And it will always go back to the point of beginning. So it's going to outline the entire perimeter of the property in writing. And if it doesn't go back to the beginning, you've got a problem. And I've actually seen that in one deed. Next, Rob. Another way of doing a property description is with a plan, a recorded plan. These are drawn up by a surveyor, a licensed surveyor, and it shows all of those lines that I talked about in the meets of bounds, the directions, the distances, the drill holes, the pins. May show any roads or buildings. Plans are great. I love to see a plan as opposed to meets and bounds. Very often in a deed, and conservation restrictions too, by the way, also need these property descriptions. Very often you'll see both plans, except it will be a reference to a plan. In a deed, it will be a reference. You won't actually see a picture of that plan, whereas in a conservation restriction, you typically see an actual picture of it. So the deed description is a registered plan is another way to describe the property. Next, Rob.
All right. Bear with me. I am going to try and take us through a registry search. I'm going to stop sharing and reshare in a moment.
You know, Rob, as you're doing that, let me verbalize one of the questions, because this may be
Great.
timely. It says, can you say more how to check for encumbrances, as they may not be in the deed itself? Maybe that relates to what you're about to do for us. Don't know.
Jassy, do you want to respond on that?
Encumbrances will typically always be written in the deed. That's where they're recorded, and that's where they're that's how you know they're there, because they'll be written in the deed. That's what makes them official. So as you read through the deed, you'll see language to the effect that it is benefited or burdened by a certain encumbrance, whether it's a right of way or whatever. But it should always be in that deed if you read it through.
Well, what if it was layered after, like or a separate, I don't know if you would call this an encumbrance, but like a mortgage or a mechanic's lien or an easement that was applied after the fact, trail easement or something?
That's the title search.
Right. That's where you always, whenever you're purchasing a piece of land, not only do you want to research the deeds, but you want to hire a company to do a title search. And it is their job to go through and let you know if there's any issues with that deed or with that ownership that you should know about. And you always should do a title search.
So that's probably covered more in the due diligence section that comes later in the series, right?
Yes, I would imagine so.
There is a question though, if there isn't a current plan, at what point in the CR process or sequence of tasks do you need to see one or get one?
Well, if there isn't a current plan, there should at the very least be the meets and bounds description. If you want to have a plan drawn up, you would have to get a surveyor to do that, and it would have to be, you know, for a plan to be recorded, it would have to be approved by the planning board of that municipality. But if there's not a recorded plan, then there will be the meets and bounds description, because that is required, a detailed property description. It's an essential
I could
element.
just add to that. There's no requirement that a property be surveyed to be conveyed. And right, so more and more we are surveying properties for the absolute, well, for the near absolute clarity that they provide, but there's no new requirement, no different from 200 years ago, where as long as you feel that, or your lawyer feels that the description in the deed into your current seller is adequate, then you can convey the land using that existing, you know, by South Street to the stone post, you know, by West Street to the stream. Those kinds of descriptions, if they can be, you know, if they are adequate to finding the land out in the world, are adequate for conveyancing. Really, the issue is, can you be sure you know what the land you're buying is? Will you, if you are choosing to acquire title insurance to protect your ownership, will your title company ensure that description, things like that.
So Rob, there are two other questions, but we'll save them for the end.
Okie doke. Okay, so I'm going to, as I said, take us through a registry search, not trusting the internet. This is actually a little video screen capture of me doing this yesterday. So I'm not too worried about losing connectivity, but we will see how it goes. There are a few ways that you can start looking for the deeds to the deed or deeds to the property that you are interested in. The first one I'm going to show is based on location, if you know where that property is. Mass Mapper is a tool of Mass GIS program that is kind of amazing, and it's got parcel information, ownership parcel or assessor's parcel information all over the state. You can come to it here, you can type in a location up in the top right, or you can just start double clicking and zooming in. And at a certain level, you will see the parcel boundaries appear, and you can click on any one of those, and you'll start, you'll get all this data that is there that is generally aligned with the assessor's data that you would find at the town assessing office. And if you're fortunate, and most of the time, you will find the last sale LS book and LS page, which is the deed that conveyed the land into the current owner, who you are hopefully who you are talking to. So this gives you, as I said, there's a book and page reference for every recorded deed. Registered deeds are a little more complicated. There are certificates of title, and it's not a book and page system. But the vast majority of what you'll encounter is recorded land with a book and page reference. So that's all I needed from Mass Mapper this time. So we're going to go back and find the Mass Land Records website that Jassy mentioned. This is a state website through which you can find all of the registries of deeds all around Massachusetts. So they were created largely when there were counties in Massachusetts. We did away with most counties in the late 90s, but there are still a couple of counties, but the registry districts still are largely aligned with the old county lines. And, you know, here they all are, every one of them. So some former counties are divided up. As you see, Franklin, Hampshire, and Hampden are one registry per area. So you can come here and you can click on a pick list, or you can simply go into the map. And we were looking in Beverly, so we're going to go to South Essex. Now, every landing page to each of those registries is a little bit different. And so if you're a local, if you're a 1 or 2 town land trust, you'll learn your applicable registry and become quite facile moving around in there. If you work statewide, you've got a little steeper learning curve bit by bit. But generally, there is always a way in to search our records. Here, you're searching from 1640 to the present. And you can search in various ways, by address, by name. If you see above at the top here, recorded land and registered land are separated. Plans and engineering are separated. So if you're looking for a plan, you can search for that. Here, I'm going to use the book and page that we pulled out of Mass Mapper for that parcel. And that takes us right into the database at that registry. Now, there are a couple of things you can do here. You'll see over at the left, there's an info block and an image block. The info just brings you to a generic, well, let's back that up a second. There we go. Brings you to kind of an overview of the transaction. Who was the grantor? Who was the grantee? When was it recorded? Where is the land? Some of just the basic factoids. We're looking for a little more detail, so we're going to go look at the image of the document itself. Again, the navigation tools that you find within the document will vary by registry. This one is, I find, a little cumbersome. Those little controls at the top disappear if you scroll down, so you have to keep scrolling up and down to work your way through. But that'll take you through. You can page through the document. You can download it and print it. Some registries have a fee, some don't. But here is that deed with all the information. There's the legal description, this time captured in an exhibit to the deed, which is quite common. And that gives you, now you found your deed for that parcel. You knew where the land was. Now you know who the owner is and a bit about how they acquired it. So the other way to get at this is by coming at it through a name search. So, you're talking to so-and-so and you want to find their land and how they acquired it. So we're going to drop in to Western Mass, the Middle Berkshire Registry. Again, you have search criteria. It's laid out a little differently, but the same kinds of things: recorded land, registered land, searching by name, book, address, date, various ways to look. We're going to search by name for our noted landowner and snoop around a little bit. This is all public record information. So we come in here and there's a whole lot of transactions with this person. In the previous example, we looked up a single deed because we had the book and page number. So we got basically one document. It had 2 rows, one listed by the buyer, one listed by the seller. Here we're looking up an individual. So we get every document or a company or whatever. We get every document that they have been a party to that is recorded at this particular registry of deeds. And we see there's quite a bit going on here. This is a nice system. You can sort by each of these columns. So if you want to see just what they were grantor on or grantee, you can search by type, or as we will do here is search by the recordation date. And we see that the earliest document here is a deed in 2002. There are some other deeds, mortgages, discharges of mortgage going on here. But now we are in this one deed, and we can see the seller here and the buyers. And again, that kind of basic information on the transaction. Or we can jump into the document itself, where we will learn a lot more. So fairly simple. All the elements are here that Jassy described. So now we're seeing very specific distances, angles, decimals of feet in dimensions. So we probably have a survey. It's not just 500 feet or so to the elm tree. And indeed, there we are. Said land contains 77 acres shown on a plan of land. And now we know exactly what the property we're dealing with is. There's a reference there for the plat file, plat F361. So if we can go back into the starting point for this registry and search on that and find the survey. We're also seeing some other interesting things here. So the land was sold together with the benefit of an easement over upon and under the surface of the water of Quarry Pond. Okay, so there's the land and the right to use the pond with others, it appears. So that's telling us a little bit more. We're learning more as we go. Moving into the document, we see that there is a waiver of a right of first refusal. So once upon a time, a right of first refusal had been imposed on this property that is being waived to allow this conveyance. So because that right of first refusal is there on record, part of this conveyance, the attorneys on this project were making sure that no clouds on title, no uncertainties were being left unaddressed, so that their client was getting very clear ownership of the land. And also, as Jassy mentioned, if you look at the bottom here, you see that it is a portion of the premises conveyed to the grantor herein by a certain deed with a book and page. So now you can start tracing the ownership backwards from this information. So let's do that briefly here. Let's go back and we see we have the seller listed over on the right-hand side here. So we can actually click on the seller as my video catches up with me, and see all the transactions that that party was involved in, including the deed by which they acquired this land. So we can work our way back. We could then go and look into that deed, look for the source deed by which the prior owner acquired, and on and on and on backwards in time. Now, one of the other things that we find here is a right of first refusal with our noted landowner as a party to it. So somewhere along the way, this landowner sold a portion of that 77 acres and then took back a right of first refusal. So we don't know, maybe they sold it to someone they knew, but they didn't want to really lose control of who their neighbor would be. So if their neighbor decides to sell someday, they get the right to buy it back if they choose to reconsolidate their property, or if they have concerns about who it would otherwise be sold to, etc. So here's an example of an actual honest to gosh right of first refusal on the record, and that will stay there, and that will affect the transaction of this property all the way forward until it is either removed, waived, or acted upon. One thing I did want to add that I did not mention earlier about rights of first refusal is that generally they expire after the first use. So if there's a right of first refusal and the land trust says, you know, we're going to pass, go ahead and sell it to that other person, we do not reestablish, you know, that's it. That was our one bite at the apple under that right of first refusal. They can be written to reoccur, or you can negotiate to have it reimposed after the transaction that you're excusing yourself from. But generally they're kind of gone at that point. So that is the bulk of our presentation. We did want to make sure we have time for further questions on anything we've touched on today. And perfect. We've got not quite 10 minutes left. So let's use a few of those for some questions, and then we'll wrap things up.
Sure. There are 2 questions that relate to this section and then 2 that relate to previous sections. This section, what is the difference between recorded deed and registered deed?
So most transactions are a recorded transaction. And basically there are literally 2 desks at the Registry of Deeds with different systems for tracking conveyancing. Most stuff goes through the recorded desk, gets a book and page number. If a given property has been litigated through the Massachusetts Land Court, it then becomes registered land. The land and the ownership of that land is registered through the court, and all through the rest of time, that property is transacted on the registered side at the Registry of Deeds. You don't need to go back to land court every time. That is sort of over and done with, but rather than a book and page and a deed, there is a deed, but then there's a new certificate of title issued to the new owner. So it basically, they are two parallel, separate but parallel systems for tracking conveyancing of land, and the registered side is simply for property that has gone through litigation to clear title problems, resolve a dispute of ownership in the past, etc.
The other one, you were talking about this earlier. How do you figure out what all those partial titles mean? I have found that Mass Mapper does not always have correct parcel lines.
I'm thinking the partial titles might be the column headings in Mass Mapper. They're kind of abbreviated and cryptic if you aren't familiar with them.
And you
Yeah.
probably just drag it so you can see the whole column heading, but
Maybe. So two thoughts on that. One is most, not all, but most towns now, the assessor's records are online. So if you go into the assessor's records, you'll be able to see the assessor's card, which is often a PDF that has all the field information that someone collected on the property. And you would be able to, all those titles will be written out, or most of them will be written out. So you'd be able to see what they mean, what those abbreviations are. I'm sure somewhere in Mass Mapper there is a list, glossary of those, but I don't know where that is. One other place you could go is if you have access to, well, maybe even in Oliver, I'm not sure that, there are different ways that attributes of GIS data can be saved and presented. So if your organization has ArcMap and has the state data for ArcMap, I believe that is more spelled out. The other critical point is that the job of the assessor is to make sure someone is being taxed on every square foot in town. They are not trying to make sure they get their boundaries precisely right. So assessor lines are not conveyancing lines ever. They're often very good approximations. If they come from a survey, the acreage will probably be exact and proper, but even then, they got to shift all those lines across the whole town to make the map of the town work and have everything fit within the town boundaries. So everyone acknowledges that the lines are not for conveyancing, they are for taxation purposes. And the values, frankly, are also for taxation purposes and not for conveyancing. They are a good indicator, perhaps, of the market value of a property, but they are not the market value of the property. They are an assessing tool for valuing the property.
there are two questions from previously. They're a bit more complex, but let's give it a shot. If one land trust owns the fee and another has an easement, everything works out. But it does expire in 10 years. If the fee owner wants to switch and the easement owner does not, what happens?
I'm not sure I'm getting the question. So land trusts, two land trusts, one has an easement over the other. Well, let me answer it kind of generically. Whereas, if you've got two parties who have rights in one another's property and they want to resolve the situation or alter the situation, an easement, a term restriction, not a permanent conservation restriction so much, but a term restriction or an easement or a right-of-way, those can all be released by recording the appropriate document at the Registry of Deeds. And then that easement or right-of-way or term restriction goes away and you can impose a new set of arrangements. So, all of these land rights things are fairly mutable. Conservation restriction is a standout example that we really don't want to be changing once they go in place. But those other kinds of tools, as we saw in that deed I showed in the Middle Berkshire Registry, there was a waiver of a right of first refusal embedded in the deed. So, those kinds of things are done rather straightforwardly if everyone is agreeing on what you want to do. If you don't have agreement, then the rights that exist are the rights you are stuck with if you can't renegotiate them and change them.
Another question, if a land trust is being offered a mixed tract of land, wooded and former agricultural, now meadow, how do you determine if there's an agricultural restriction on it?
So any agricultural preservation restriction is a recorded document. You could look for it yourself. Your title exam certainly would disclose it. So, if you could talk to the Mass Department of Agricultural Resources, because they track their agricultural preservation restrictions very closely. So again, it's like any other encumbrance on the land. It's really a research question, and the registry is a great place for that. I will note that different states have different laws. In Massachusetts, land is conveyed when the grantor hands the deed to the grantee and payment is made, or the other conditions of the transference are met. The recording of that deed at the registry is really an announcement to the world that you now own it. And so imagine an unsavory landowner who sells their land to 3 people. The one who gets to the registry first has a distinct advantage in any ensuing legal dispute. So that's why everyone, gets on record right away as soon as, but the transfer actually happens at delivery of the deed. Generally, conservation restriction, that is not the case. They become effective when recorded. I'm digressing. We are running out of time. So Is there one last question, or should
There's
I
one
move
last
into-
question, and then we'll wrap it up. Do APRs show up in Mass Mapper?
Not in the simple assessment layer tool. There is probably a layer. If you go into Mass Mapper, there are all kinds of layers you can turn on and off. And I am sure there is a layer of all kinds of protection, including APRs. There's probably one of land ownership in a protected status, and then one of protection interests, like a CR, APR, etc. Not a guarantee, but it's a great place to be looking for that.
I think one of our future sessions on conservation planning might get into that kind of issue a little bit.
Great.
Yeah.
I just wanted to show this very quickly. These are some of the websites that we have referenced today, or meant to reference today. These are easily found out there. Mass Land Records, we talked about the CR state model at mass.gov. You can easily find by little browser searching. Mass Mapper tool we talked about, and Mass Woods is another great resource for conservation tools. I mentioned it in the context of chapter 61, but it's got a lot of other good information on there.
Thanks very much, Rob and Jassy, for a very informative session. I hope that people who asked questions got their questions answered. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.